If you count holograms, visions, and the like, Weyoun appeared in 24 episodes of Deep Space Nine, one of the largest for any individual villain throughout the franchise. And yet we see very little of Weyoun not related to his duty. As a villain, Weyoun was the face of the Dominion. While the Jem'Hadar were the ones spreading death and destruction across the Alpha Quadrant, we know that in the majority of cases, it was on orders that Weyoun had either issued or approved. Unlike, say, Dukat, we see almost nothing about Weyoun unrelated to his work. No stories of his history, no bonding over a campfire. The related video, Treachery, Faith, and the Great River, is probably the closest we get to that, and about the only thing he shares with Odo is the story of his people's origins. I'll be getting into that story at the end of the month. But Weyoun himself, we see little. Weyoun is the ideal of Dominion servants. In contrast to Fight Club, Weyoun is his job. Much is made of the Jem'Hadar commitment to the cause of fighting, but Weyoun is equally committed to his own form of fighting, and just as ruthless. But like a shark, he does come with a smile. We first encountered Weyoun in To the Death, where he was serving as the Vorta in command of a Jem'Hadar task force that was hunting down rogue Jem'Hadar. These renegade Jem'Hadar were seeking to use an Iconian gateway as a means of launching attacks anywhere in the galaxy, making them a threat to both the Dominion and the Federation, necessitating the temporary alliance with Cisco and the Defiant in order to eliminate the gateway. While an important mission, it might seem rather small time by comparison to his later role, but this was because there was a dual nature to this mission. The Founders wanted Odo returned to them for judgment in the death of the shapeshifter in The Adversary, and Weyoun was chosen to be their instrument in that. During the operation, Weyoun touches Odo's shoulder, which was the moment that Odo was infected by the disease that would force his return. Weyoun was likely chosen for this mission because of the high degree of trust the Founders had in him. He was both unwavering in his belief in their godhood and wisdom, and grasped what the Jem'Hadar beneath him did not, that despite what had happened, Odo was still one of them. It is not the place of the Jem'Hadar or the Vorta to judge him, only the Founders themselves had such a right. Weyoun could be relied upon to handle events precisely as they wished, and to show Odo the respect that he deserved as one of them. It's thus no surprise that Weyoun would be Dominion supervisor over Cardassia when it was admitted in By Inferno's Light, although he himself was not seen in this role until later that season in Ties of Blood and Water. The significance of that role cannot be overstated, because Cardassia was the Dominion foothold in the Alpha Quadrant. So Weyoun was the senior-most Dominion official in the most strategically significant region in the entirety of the Dominion. This trust seems well placed for two reasons. While under Weyoun's leadership, the Dominion was able to dominate the Alpha Quadrant for years despite being completely cut off from the Gamma Quadrant, requiring ultimately a union of the major powers and an internal revolt within their power base itself in order to thwart them. And it should be noted the difference between events in the Dominion War arc and the final chapter arc. In the former, the female changeling was content to allow Weyoun and Dukat to handle events, limiting herself mostly to just reminding him of the need for success. And in that case, it was only the intervention of the prophets on behalf of their emissary that their plans were thwarted. In the latter case, the female changeling took an active role in events, issuing orders and conducting negotiations personally, events which led to the Cardassian uprising that was arguably responsible for the Dominion losing the war. Weyoun always worked with people to try to keep them happy. Even when he was delivering sharp comments, he would follow it up with diplomatic attempts to try to smooth things over. It was when it came to carrying out the female changeling's wishes that this would cease, because of his unquestioning belief in them. As an example of the latter, when the Breen demanded that they wanted to be given Earth when the war was over, I can't imagine who from Earth would have so upset them that they would insist that they be able to lord over that world. But the female changeling agreed with the Breen, even though Weyoun had been told that he would be in charge of all former Federation territory. And yet, he never treated that as going back on the deal. He stated it must have been a misunderstanding on his part. But even in his willingness to carry out the harsh commands of the female changeling, he would attempt to smooth things over, to appeal to the bigger picture that the Founder was looking at, so that whoever he was talking to would see the wisdom in acts that otherwise might have seemed like errors. Weyoun handled Damar deftly when he was installing him as a puppet ruler. It was the final insult of the female changeling giving away Cardassian territory to the Breen that directly caused the rebellion that turned the tide of the war. Not to mention that her insistence on exterminating the Cardassian people in the midst of battle and revolt is precisely what allowed the headquarters to be breached and the Dominion leadership captured. Treachery Faith in the Great River provides insight into the character of Weyoun by seeing the shift that takes place in Weyoun 6. As a high-ranking, grinning toady far from the action, it could have been assumed that Weyoun was a coward, but we see the exact opposite is the case. No one knows more than Weyoun himself the power of the Dominion, and yet he chose, solely for reasons of conscience, to throw everything away, his power, his influence, his respect, and possibly his very life. Weyoun could have easily played it safe and remained within the Dominion, but he possessed the strength of character to take action and turn his back on his allegiances and his own people in order to do the right thing. This is more than just the change in attitude regarding the war, because as we see in the final chapter arc, Weyoun holds the Founder over his own life even when she mulls over taking it, after the cloning facility is destroyed, thus ensuring that he could not be resurrected. And when she is near death, he says with the utmost sincerity that he would die in her place if he could, mirroring the events of treachery when he did die for Odo. He's no fool, he wishes to avoid death, but he is as committed as the Jem'Hadar to the cause of victory, and just as willing to lay down his life for the cause. Beyond his duty, we see little of Weyoun. In Ties of Blood and Water, we see that he delights in playing Dabo, and says that he loves games. No surprise, since he seems to have a sharp political mind and a keen sense of military strategy and tactics. In Favors the Bold, we learn that Weyoun and his people have no sense of aesthetics, so when he receives a prize-winning work of art that Sial had made, he cannot appreciate it. But he struggles to. He attempts to understand it, even if he can't actually appreciate it as a work of art. This seems to be a trait of his, as an unfilmed scene from You Are Cordially Invited revealed. Weyoun actually had Dr. Bashir's quarters during their control of the station, and on returning, Bashir found the place was filled with odd bits of junk. Shoes, coasters, bits of string, picture frames, and table legs being amongst some of the bits of junk that he brought back. Weyoun would spend his off hours collecting this stuff so he could examine it in greater detail in private. It suggests that he is intensely curious about things. Games are something easy to master. They have clearly defined rules that, once he grasps, he can manipulate to his own ends. But with other aspects of life outside of the Dominion's center of power, things aren't so easy to comprehend, and he wishes to. The way he studied the painting, for instance, like it was a puzzle that it had to be sorted out, and striking out almost desperately and wondering if perhaps being blue would affect the aesthetic value of the piece. It shows how he was not content with ignorance, even of things that he was not created to comprehend. The Dominion was described as the anti-Federation, so it's no surprise that this authority echoed Picard's comment that the goal is to better ourselves and the rest of the species. But nevertheless, Weyoun was ruthless. While he often sought to be liked by everyone, including his enemies, he was not above brutal acts in service of the Dominion. When victory over the Alpha Quadrant seemed all but assured, Weyoun decided that Earth would be the focal point of rebellion, and thus he would eradicate the population. Billions to be exterminated based on a rebellion that had not even begun yet, because the conquest hadn't even been completed yet. Likewise, when the Cardassian people began to join in Damar's rebellion, he was the one who suggested wiping out a city of 2 million people to try to terrify them into submission. Weyoun believed in the effectiveness of a harsh example, also illustrated when he was planning to have Rom executed for his role in creating the mines that blocked the wormhole. As he said, it was to make people think twice about acting against the Dominion. This is an extension of his own belief in the vision of the Founders. All territories, all worlds, all lives belong to them, and anything that must be lost, even his own life, to ensure that order and authority is unchallenged, is an option for him. At the same time, Weyoun seems to be willing to be reasonable when the situation allows for it. With Jake writing stories biased against the Dominion, Weyoun chooses simply to block their transmission. He didn't have Jake arrested or anything like that. He was willing to give Jake further chances to come around to a more neutral position. And he served as a check on Dukat, preventing him from turning back the clock to the bad old days of the occupation, and to instead cooperate with the Bajorans, perfectly willing to yank his leash when necessary in order to ensure that he got the point. Dukat was perhaps the one that Weyoun was most harsh with throughout the series, because the former was determined to have his way whenever he could get away with it, while others were more willing to compromise with Weyoun's seeming efforts to do the same. This is probably why he's a more popular villain. While he is a merciless one with no regard for the sanctity of life, he is nevertheless fully committed to the ideals of his cause rather than his own personal desires. He seems to genuinely want to get along with people, and despite his ignorance in many areas, he is shrewd and cunning, and we enjoy an adversary that is a worthy foil to the heroes. Weyoun's failure in the end was not because he was blinded to his own flaws, but blinded to the flaws in his leader. His demise was in trusting in the wisdom of a false god rather than in himself. Perhaps a fitting end for a character who was introduced in an episode that showed a device similar to a Stargate, and that, much like the false gods of that program, failed, so too was his downfall tied to the failure of his own false gods. So while DS9 was often chided by some fans for being in opposition to what they felt Star Trek was really about, we see in him that a powerful, ruthless, and cunning leader can be brought low simply by misplaced faith. And that seems to be lockstep with the message of Star Trek.